Chapter 20. The tests at Christmas Island. Operation Grapple. During the final stages of preparation for the move of the squadron to Christmas Island, I had given much thought to the task ahead. The long flights up to the island would require constant vigilance and skill from all the crews. Long transoceanic flights and sometimes bad weather, with limited navigation aids, were in themselves somewhat of a hazard. In this respect, I did have the recent experience behind me from the proving flight in March. The main dangers to be faced would come in the H-bomb tests themselves. The squadron had carried out atomic cloud sampling in Australia, but no one had been through an H-bomb thermonuclear cloud to obtain samples. Since I had nominated myself and my crew to be the first to do so, we would be the guinea pigs. There were a number of special areas where danger lurked and where the final outcome remained unknown. Firstly, there was the problem of operating at, then, such extreme altitudes. Secondly, the dosage of radiation we would have to take on the first run through the cloud could only be guessed at. The third and possibly the greatest danger came from the possibility of a large temperature change from inside the cloud to that prevailing inside the aircraft cabin. There was a risk that any sudden major change in temperature could cause the aircraft cockpit canopy to crack or break. If this happened, the aircraft and crew would suffer an explosive decompression. At the high altitude we would be operating, such an explosive decompression could cause severe physical damage to the crew, especially to their lungs. In this event, the only chance of survival would be to carry out a maximum possible rate of descent to a lower altitude and higher air pressure. I had thought deeply over the above risks and prepared myself mentally to face them with as much coolness and courage as I could muster. The reader may ask why I was prepared to face these risks, but to me the reason was clear. Britain did not have a nuclear deterrent in the form of thermonuclear weapons or H-bombs. Nationally, it was considered essential, thereby, to give Britain a major say in world decisions. We had to have the deterrent and be a member of the major powers' nuclear club. On this reasoning, I considered I had an important part to play in the essential testing and development of the H-bomb. In this aim I was prepared, as in war, to do my duty and face the risks involved. Having thought this whole operation through, and settled my determination, I was ready to do what was necessary in leading my squadron. Consequently, on the 16th of April, along with 2 aircraft and crews, my crew and I again set off for Brisbane, Fiji, Canton Island and Christmas Island. We had a good trip all the way through and were well received by the friends we had already made on the various stopovers. On arrival at Christmas Island, we were met by Air Commodore Weir, Group Captain Giles and the 76th Squadron Courier crew. We were shown to our squadron office, a wooden hut in amongst the coconut palm trees, alongside the main aircraft dispersal area. A big change had taken place since my earlier visit in March. Already, there was a noticeable build-up in men, equipment and machines. The Shackletons, Hastings and Dakotas were in place, plus a major increase in servicemen and the civilian scientific personnel of all. The domestic site was a few miles from the operational area, and sited along the beach. Primarily, it was a fully tented camp designed to house up to 5,000 personnel, of which 2 were ladies. These 2 stalwarts were members of the Women's Volunteer Service. Billy and Mary were there to provide welfare services for the servicemen. They organized social activities and offered counseling to the men, which only such ladies can offer. In the event that they were marvelous and did a superb job. I am sure they would not be offended if I mentioned a joking reference to them. These 2 lovely ladies were in their 40s. The chaps who spent a long time at Christmas Island, away from the own ladies, always said that Billy and Mary got younger every day. I was shown my tent, which I was to share with the CO of No. 100 Squadron Canberras. This delighted me, for it was none other than my old flight commander, Dougie Hammett, from Kinloss days. The tent was a few yards from the beach overlooking the reef beyond and the short distance to take a swim inside the reef. During my stay at Christmas, 2 dramatic events occurred whilst men were swimming. We were warned not to swim close to the reef, due to the huge tow as the water receded when the breakers rolled in and out. The power of the tow was so great that a man could easily be sucked across the reef to the ocean beyond. This raised 3 dangers, from drowning, being cut pieces on the sharp coral on the reef, and lastly, from the ever-present sharks. The first incident was when a man was sucked over the reef. A rescue helicopter was dispatched to get him out. Despite valiant efforts by the helicopter winchman, the fury of the waves prevented him being raised out of danger. The helicopter crew reported seeing his bloody body alongside the reef with sharks hungrily surrounding him. His body was never recovered. The second incident happened near dusk one evening, when 4 men were lost over the reef and out to sea. A young Nation Service airman, who was a powerful swimmer, went out 4 times through the shark-infested waters. Over 20 minutes and gathering dusk, he rescued all 4. His bravery was justifiably rewarded by the award of the George Medal. Like all small Pacific islands, there was the constant roar of the surf and about a 15 miles per hour breeze to reduce the effects of heat. During the day, tent flips could be tied up to give the full cooling effect from the sea breeze. The island was really just one large coconut plantation, so we weren't short of coconuts. We were also not short of land crabs, for they were there in their thousands. Unfortunately, land crabs are not the eatable variety, and when you ran over them, they gave an awful crack, and the liquid poured out. There were also colonies of hermit crabs on the beach and its surrounds. Magnificent birds abounded, from huge frigate birds, booby birds and delicate white terns. Because they were not hunted, they were all incredibly tame, and you could go within a few feet of them and they would not move. Great opportunities were taken for photographing them in this lovely environment. The officers' mess was a huge marquee, also on the beach, with a superb sea view of the reef and breakers in front. One could sit there for hours just gazing out on the beauty of it all. Food at first was very limited, from, mostly, a diet of service compo rations. However, a great effort was made, which succeeded in a huge improvement to the menu. It was arranged for daily runs to be made by the Hastings transport aircraft to fly fresh produce from the abundant supplies in Hawaii. In addition, any aircraft, staging through the areas which had fresh produce, loaded up as much as possible. In the end, we fed quite well in the circumstances. The bar was well stocked with canned beer and cheap spirits, so one could always drown one's sorrows or homesickness from this ample supply. We had great parties in the mess, and Will Fulton and his staff frequently came over from their senior officers' mess, including Bill Cook, the chief scientific officer. Later Sir William Cook, Will Fulton was a first-class pianist, and on Saturday night he would lead great sing-songs. The spirit was excellent, and this sort of activity made it better. In addition, every effort was made to get mail out and back fast. In fact, we were getting letters from the UK in only 2 or 3 days, a huge factor in morale boosting when in so remote an area. Fresh water was in reasonably plentiful supply for washing, provided by a large desalination plant operated by the Royal Navy. This plant had large chimneys, or funnels, and naturally was christened HMS Grapple. We had not lost our sense of humor. One wag, a scientist of R.A.A.F, erected a hut and put a sign at fish and chips. When it rained, we were not short of water for sure, aided by the tropical storms which made certain of that as the heavens opened. It was not uncommon, when it teemed down, to see all the occupants running out from their tents, in the nude, with a bar of soap, to take a soft fresh rainwater shower. HMS Grapple water, though plentiful, was hard to get a lather. On the debit side, things became very difficult in heavy rain, insofar as mobility was concerned. The sand and crushed coral roads soon became extremely boggy. The amount of rain that deluged down did not do much good for aircraft standing idle either. Radio and electrical problems escalated considerably in such conditions. Aircraft are always better when they are flying regularly, and this was no exception. The build-up almost complete, the rehearsals began. The Valiant, carrying the weapon, would fly its special pattern to the point of the drop at Malden Island. The naval ships were all in place, including the main control ship HMS Warrior, an aircraft carrier. The ship also had a special significance to 76 Squadron and the sampling roll. In the event of the aforementioned explosive decompression we might suffer, it was planned to ditch alongside HMS Warrior, should things become too disastrous. A further protection was devised to protect 76 Squadron crews from the explosive decompression. High altitude protective waistcoats were especially flown out from UK. These would inflate immediately if decompression occurred and act as a constant pressure to keep the wearer's lungs intact. We also had a pressure helmet applied, but this proved no good. Wing Commander Jeffrey Denham, a doctor specializing in aviation medicine, bought it out for me to try. I got all kitted up, got into my aircraft, started up, taxied out and got ready for takeoff. The helmet had no air outlet, and as we lined up, Jeffrey asked me if all was well. I replied, there is only one snag, I can't see. The immense heat of the day meant that by the time we got to takeoff point we were sweating profusely. In this case, my head enclosed in the helmet caused rivers of sweat to run into my eyes and blind me temporarily. It was obvious that unless the helmet visor could be left open until one got airborne, it was useless. A conference was held with Will Fulton in the chair, and the facts put before him. Decisive as always, he ruled out the use of the helmet until it could be modified. We were to use the pressure waistcoat only. One other protection was a small film tag which registered our thyroid count after exposure to radiation. This was checked after exposure to give an accurate assessment of radiation dosage absorbed by the individual wearing the film badge. The next 2 weeks were of intense activity by all concerned. 3 rehearsals for the whole operation were carried out, the third being a dress rehearsal. The weather was playing a very important factor in going ahead with each rehearsal, and every rehearsal was vital in order to exercise all parts of the operation. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, an area in which tropical storms were prevalent, hovered continuously around Christmas Island. Each day when it moved south over the island, heavy continuous rain would result, causing havoc to flying operations. It also made everything so much more difficult to do. Mobility, serviceability, maintenance, and even just day-to-day living became literally bogged down. Dougie Hammett, CO-100 Squadron, had a very narrow escape when he had radio compass failure on a meteorological recce flight. His aircraft encountered heavy weather, during which turbulence and icing all added to the problems. Finally, after help from another Canberra flown by the OC flying Group Captain Giles, who shepherded them down by radio, they landed safely, but very, very low on fuel. 100 squadron crews experienced a lot of the worst weather on these recce flights, as it was their job to establish the position and movement of the ITCZ. Their other task, as a photographic recce squadron, was to take high-level photos of the H-bomb cloud on the actual day of the drop. Dougie was a very relieved man when he got back to our tents later that evening. The problems of high-altitude flying, above 50,000 feet, were considerable. The temperatures got below -70 degrees centigrade, outside air. When I was up one day, we recorded an outside temperature of -96 degrees centigrade. In the very rarefied atmosphere, these low temperatures could result in an engine compressor stall, and subsequent flame out, an adverse effect which could also occur in severe turbulence. Once an engine flamed out, it was necessary to descend to be able to relight the engine. In the older Canberras this meant descending to 15,000 feet, but a modification was in hand to increase the maximum descending relight height to 35,000 feet. Urgent action was being taken to modify all our aircraft, and until this was completed, a flame out and descent to relight the engine caused use of valuable fuel reserves. This was to have a near disaster for 2 of my crews in a later ferry flight to Fiji. The operational requirement of flying about 50,000 feet meant that pilots had to exercise considerable skill in maintaining the extreme altitudes required. Turns had to be carefully executed to avoid installing the aircraft or the engine compressor. Fortunately, I never had that happen to me, but it did mean, however, that the racetrack pattern we had to hold, prior to being called in to sample the nuclear cloud, had to be flown very accurately and carefully. In the rehearsals we practiced all the various safeguards, including the use of our special sampling equipment. The latter comprised 2 methods of obtaining the required samples. Samples of chemical matter were collected on special filters fitted on an extension unit in the nose of the wingtip fuel tanks. Electrically operated bungs closed the opening to these units, and these bungs were then opened on entering the cloud and closed on exit. When open, the chemical substances in the cloud impacted on the filters, allowing for subsequent collection. Gas samples were collected in a gas tank fitted in the bomb bay of the aircraft. Again, these samples were gathered by opening and shutting a vent to the tank, in similar fashion to the bungs in the wingtip tanks. Protection of the crew and the aircraft took several forms. Firstly, the fact that the crew wore oxygen masks at altitude normally gave ingestion protection. The aircraft pressure system was fitted with filters to ensure relatively uncontaminated air entered the cockpit. Protection against heat flash from the explosion was vital. In addition, the navigators sitting in the rear, behind the curtain, normally used for reading the radar, were automatically protected from the flash. The pilot was more vulnerable, and to protect him, two simple methods were used. Firstly, he had to avoid looking out, but fly solely on instruments as the burst occurred. Secondly, he also lowered his seat to be looking at the instruments from as low a position as possible. The third practical remedy was to wear a blank patch over one eye. This means that if the flash blinded one eye temporarily, or worse, it would not blind the eye with the patch. Simple but effective, and very much the pirate touch. From 76 Squadron's point, the rehearsals went well. The tropopause was, fortunately, keeping relatively lower than expected and hovered around 54 to 57,000 feet. We hoped that this situation would prevail so that we would be able to reach the required height without too much difficulty. Nearer the day of the drop, the weather looked like causing a delay in the actual bomb drop, as very heavy rain went on all day just before the big day. Fortunately, it cleared up in time. Absolute secrecy was required to prevent any protest vessels entering the publicized danger zone as the D-Day, drop day, approached. Every effort had been made to forestall a known threat by a Japanese protest fleet of small vessels, who had threatened to enter the area and disrupt the tests. The UK press had helped in this matter, by leaking a report that Sir William Penny was travelling to Christmas Island later in the year. Everyone thought that the tests would not go ahead if he was not present. Bill Cook was in charge of the scientific team, and he had the responsibility on the spot. In the event no disruption took place, we had all the aircraft serviceable for the day of short one Grapple. I was to be primary sampler. Flight Lieutenant Lindsay Cummins was carrying the sampling controller, Air Commodore Dennis Wilson, an R.A.A.F medical specialist in radiology, and in particular nuclear radiation aspects. Dennis Wilson had the responsibility, when airborne, to monitor the explosion cloud and decide when it was safe to send me in, as primary sampler. Flight Lieutenant Barry Newton was secondary sampler and Flight Lieutenant Dennis Spatcher as reserve, the latter to remain on the ground at Christmas unless called. The countdown to H hours started the day prior to the drop, and the tension built up. We were now to be a dramatic part of Britain's history, and there was a feeling of apprehension and excitement at what we were about to experience. The weather fined up and we all spent a quiet night of preparation. The day, the 15th of May, dawned in all its tropical splendor. Early calls, breakfast and last-minute preparations went smoothly ahead. With a superb touch of humor and a marvelous way of relaxing us all, Ginger Weir had the strains of My Fair Lady selections playing over the PA. This show, so immensely popular at the time, gave us the lovely voice of Julie Andrews singing I Could Have Danced All Night, as an accompaniment to our preparations. Truly a magical touch. I can never hear this music without recalling that historic day in the middle of the Pacific. From first light, aircraft began taking off to carry out specific tasks to build up a pattern for the total operation. The climax would be the actual bomb release and subsequent detonation. The Shackletons and Canberras took off on their Met recces and surveillance sorties. The Shackletons, along with naval vessels, were scouring the danger area to ensure that no ships had wandered into the area, for any shipment detected in the area could have caused delays. Fortunately, all went well, the weather was right and the area declared clear. My crews and I had our final briefings at Joint Operations Center and then moved down to our aircraft dispersal and squadron office. A dramatic moment occurred when the Valiant, piloted by the 49 Squadron CO Ken Hubbard, rolled along the runway gathering speed with its lethal load on board. We all watched with relief as it climbed away in the morning sunlight, gleaming white in its anti-glare livery. In contrast, 76 Squadron sampling aircraft stood in dispersal covered in a greenish water-based barrier paint. This coat of paint had been put on a couple of days earlier, and was designed to be easily washed off, allowing the inevitable heavy radiation contamination to be minimized after exposure in the nuclear cloud. It was approaching mid-morning and we were close to being ordered to take off for Malden Island, 400 miles to the south and across the equator. So close to the equator was Christmas Island that we crossed it nearly every time we flew. Because of the need to get to 50,000 feet plus, and could only do so by carrying minimum fuel, we were not due to take off until the H-bomb had been successfully dropped. We listened out on the operational frequency and heard the Valiant flying its pattern and reporting at various points. It carried out a practice run and then declared the next run to be a live drop. Clearance was given to Ken Hubbard from the task force commander in the operations room on HMS Warrior to go ahead. The dramatic countdown came over the air and then the vital call bomb gone. The Valiant then carried out a tight turn-in and escape maneuver to clear the aircraft from suffering heat or blast damage as the weapon detonated. By this time, after a period of a dry mouth wait, I was airborne, followed by Barry Newton, en route to the ground zero area, where the drop would occur. We heard it all as we climbed up. Our call signs had been changed from the normal, somewhat humorously. The controller was Sniff Boss, I was Sniff 1 and Barry Newton Sniff 2, apt names for samplers. I reported into Air Commodore Wilson as Sniff Boss and continued my climb. Fortunately, the tropopause was at 54,000 feet and I did not anticipate any problems reaching that altitude. On reaching the area, I flew into our predetermined racetrack, viewing the awesome spectacle of the huge anvil nuclear cloud leveled out at the tropopause. I received the go-ahead to do the first penetration. It was a tense moment, not much time to reflect on all the dangers mentioned earlier. Into the cloud we flew and fortunately, little turbulence was experienced and no danger to the canopy from heat change. Immediate relief was felt as our worst fears diminished. My crew started to report radiation readings on the special instruments, also opening up the sampling equipment on entry. It was eerie in the cloud and the main difference from ordinary cloud was that inside it was multicolored. Pale purples, yellows mixed with whites. I steered for the stronger colored parts where I figured the best samples would be obtained, of matter and gas. We reported radiation readings as Romeo, the dose rate registered and Charlie giving the cumulative dose. The rates permitted me to do a further 2 runs and then the controller instructed me to finish sampling and return to base. It was with relief and happiness that we immediately set off to return to Christmas Island as fast as possible. From such a height we were able to make a swift and gradual descent and land. We were cleared to land and taxi to a special decontamination area, where a specially trained team in heavy protective clothing marshaled us in. A short wait whilst they monitored the aircraft with their Geiger counters to establish radiation levels, and then we were cleared to leave the aircraft. I opened the clear vision window and the navigator opened the escape door. To avoid us picking up any further radiation from the outside of the aircraft as we climbed out, they covered exit and steps with PVC sheets. We moved away and watched the scientific team removing the filters and gas tank, to be dispatched post-haste to UK for analysis by Canberra's positioned en route in relay. As we entered the decontamination center we were constantly monitored. All our clothing was removed as it was radioactive and we showered until declared clear. It was in the hair that the worst occurred, but it was not dangerous radiation, only beta-ray contamination which could be washed off. I had to shower 6 times before declared clear to leave. Well, at last, after all the waiting it was over and we felt great at such success. After debriefing, a feeling of anticlimax and a wait for the other crews to return safely. The whole operation had been a triumph of planning and execution. Everyone involved was on cloud 9, as we all wound down and savored success. We wondered what would be the reaction at home when the news broke, and our thoughts turned to our families and loved ones, 12,000 miles away. There was a great party on the island that night as everyone celebrated in their respective messes and clubs. Will Fulton, Bill Cook and all the senior officers joined us as we sang and drank long into the night. Dougie Hammett and I finally returned to our tent and reflected on the day. As squadron commanders we could be well pleased with our part in the successful participation of both our squadrons on this momentous occasion. Britain now had the H-bomb and was at last a full nuclear power. We had done it and felt justifiable pride in its successful outcome. As a reward for our efforts, the squadron crews were given a perk in that we were sent to the huge United States Air Force Base at Hickam, alongside Honolulu International Airport for a 2-day stopover. Due to the generosity of the USAF, we were able to stay at the American Forces Hotel at Fort DeRousie on Waikiki Beach. We flew into Honolulu and were met by Squadron Leader John Claridge, an old bomber chum of mine. He was doing a first-class job as OC-160 Wing Detachment at Honolulu. We were able to relay and enjoy the beauty and very civilized facilities of Hawaii, a remarkable change after the primitive conditions of Christmas Island. We spent a most memorable night at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, thanks to John Claridge, who had got us tickets to attend a super cabaret night in honor of Henry J. Kaiser. He was the noted shipping magnate who made the famous wartime Liberty ships. He was celebrating his 70th birthday and star performers had come from the States, Hawaii and Tahiti to take part in the show. It was a great night of entertainment, capped when Henry J himself came over to meet those R.A.A.F boys, as he put it. He bought us a drink and chatted with us for a while. After 2 happy days we flew back to Christmas to prepare for the next shot of Grapple. My task in the shot 2 was a thrilling one. My crew and I were to fly Wing Commander Jeffrey Denham to see the weapon detonate and climb up to sample the stem of the mushroom cloud. Having missed seeing the first detonation, we were to have a grandstand seat for the second. After a couple of rehearsals, the next drop came on the 31st of May. We were able to witness the awe-inspiring sight of the flash and see the fireball develop with incredible rapidity, then rise at about 10,000 feet per second. It was mind-boggling to see the size and ferocity of this wide cauldron of death and to visualize what it would do to a large city. I tried to imagine it over London and the horror such a weapon could inflict. I soon reached the area of the cloud, and on the OK from the sampler controller we went through the stem. It was only slightly bumpy and only took a few seconds to fly through. We continued to circle round and view this amazing sight, and as we watched the whole development, the mushroom cloud flattened out at the tropopause. My flight commander, Flight Lieutenant Barry Newton, was then called in to commence sampling. He was followed by Dennis Spatcher as secondary sampler. Once again all went well and the day was a further success for us and for Britain. There was one more shot to come and we began thinking about the return to Australia and then home. It was not to be, for we were asked to volunteer for a further series at Maralinga. I knew Gladys would not be pleased, but, as it would only be for about a 6-week period, I agreed to stay. Before shot 3 I had the privilege and honor to take the scientific director, Bill Cook, for a flight round Christmas Island. It was strange as we flew around the island, to think that I was flying the namesake of the great explorer, Captain Cook. Both in different ways had made their name in Britain's history, ancient and modern. Bill Cook was a modest, unassuming man, not at all the vision normally portrayed of a top nuclear scientist. He spoke quietly and talked of nuclear matters in the simplest of terms, making it easy to understand what we were out to achieve. His other colleague who dealt with us, briefing us on our role, was a Dr. Morgan, a down-to-earth man who again expressed the complicated nuclear science in simple terms. It was an honor to know and work with these men who were doing so much for their country, quietly and efficiently. My task on shot 3 was to fly the sampler controller. Once again we would have a fabulous view of the whole operation. This time we had a view at higher level and watched the fireball and cloud develop and rise up to our height and beyond to the tropopause. Flight Lieutenant Dennis Spatcher did the sampling first. It was a third successful day and the culmination of this series of tests. It was over completely for the majority, but now we were off to another series. I flew Air Commander Weir to Fiji. The day nearly ended in disaster as we flew direct from Christmas to Fiji, missing out a landing at Canton Island. We struck unexpected storms en route and the other 2 aircraft both suffered engine flameouts, having to drop down and relight and thereby run short on fuel. They landed at Nandi Airport almost out of fuel. We decided there and then that there would be no further direct flights from Christmas to Fiji, but that future flights would carry out a mandatory refueling stop at Canton Island. It was a near thing and we felt greatly relieved that everyone got into Nandi okay. There was a change this time, in that I was to fly Ginger Weir on to New Zealand, and we flew into Royal New Zealand Air Force Base at R.A.A.F in the North Island. But what a contrast from the balmy Pacific Islands. It was winter in New Zealand when we landed at R.A.A.F in low cloud and a cold wind gusting 30 to 35 knots, thinking we would be flying straight back to Australia from Christmas. We had no warm clothing with us. We were in tropical uniform, shorts and short-sleeved shirts, and it was one of the coldest stopovers I ever had. The greeting from the Kiwi Air Force was very warm though, but little did I know how many times I would visit R.A.A.F in the future. The Kiwis were very interested in our Canberras, for they were about to re-equip with them in the next year. Little did I know also, that one of the ground crew was to be my future son-in-law. However, that would all be well into the future. The next day I flew Will Fulton from R.A.A.F to Laverton on base near Melbourne. He had been to the New Zealand capital, Wellington, to personally brief the New Zealand Prime Minister on the tests. We had a good flight over and we said our goodbyes. He was very complimentary to me on my overall performance and I well remember his words. "George," he said, "you were magnificent." I was very proud to receive such high praise. "Good luck in the next tests," were his final words. After he and Ginger Weir departed, I flew on to Edinburgh Field, after a night stop in Melbourne, giving me a chance to see this fine city for the first time. After we broke cloud over the lofty range of hills, east of Adelaide, on return to Edinburgh Field, it was a very different sight to when we left. Our departure 3 months earlier had been in summer, when all the ground was burnt and brown from the scorching heat. Winter had now well set in and the scenery was one of green hills and fields, a huge contrast from April. Returning to Edinburgh was very pleasant. I met up with all my Aussie friends, service and civilian. Also the R.A.A.F chaps based at Edinburgh. We had many stories to tell and we, thankfully, could bask in the success of the operation. It had been one of the greatest, if not the greatest, highlights in my career. The places we had been, the sights and historic events we had seen and would remain etched in our memories forever. The vividness of it all has enabled me to write of it so easily after 36 years. It was as if it were yesterday. There was disappointment at not being able to go home to Gladys and Valerie, to share these memories, and it was at times like this I felt a deep longing to be home with them. However, there was a further job to be done. Operation Antler at Maralinga had to be carried out first.